Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode, we're going to talk about a fine film, a cinematic masterpiece, one of the best films of all time. And that is, of course, the prequel to Gettysburg, Gods and Generals.
Oh my goodness. What a film, Max.
What a film. We've talked about this film for a very long time.
Yeah.
Ever since high school. I remember in high school, it was on TV, or I watched scenes from like a YouTube video or something, and I was like, this movie looks very interesting.
Oh, it is, though. And I can say that I saw this movie in theaters.
Yeah, one of the very few.
One of the very few. Well, there were more people than you'd think. It was like the opening weekend.
Okay.
And I was relatively young to the point that my dad took me, and I was the youngest person in the theater, and my father was the second youngest person in the theater. And I remembered thinking, this movie's weird, and also, why is there an intermission? Like a legit intermission where like I got up and went to the bathroom.
If you look it up, there's like a list of movies that have intermissions in them, and this is one of the very last ones.
Yeah.
The Hateful Eight had one, and some other movie, and this movie, and like that's the last three, I think.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's this movie is.
It's really something else.
Well, when the movie Gettysburg was made in the early 90s, it was actually intended to be like a mini series, and then they converted it into a big long movie.
Really?
It was supposed to be like a 3-episode mini series.
I had no idea.
And then Ted Turner got his hands on it, I guess, and decided he wanted it to be a full-length motion picture. So, and then they decided, in the great tradition of the movie Gettysburg, which actually isn't that bad, especially compared to this. This is not a very good movie. This movie is not as good as Gettysburg. But Gettysburg, there's some scenes that are really good in Gettysburg. Overall, it's okay. This movie, not very good.
Little Round Top. That's
the Little Round Top scene in the movie Gettysburg is great.
Yeah.
And apparently, when they reviewed the movie, Ebert and Siskel and Ebert said that they thought that Jeff Daniels actually perhaps merited an Oscar nomination. Let me say, not as much in this movie, but
he's quite sad in this movie.
He is.
He's a bit down in the dumps for a lot of it.
Yeah. This movie, and we're really gonna dissect it. But Gettysburg wasn't bad, and then this is like 10 years later that this came out.
I think 10 years exactly.
I think it was 93 and 2003 when these two came out. But
we're kind of talking around why it's so different and interesting.
The movie Gettysburg feels like tries to be historical, and it used reenactors, and they actually filmed it at Gettysburg at the national park there. Yeah. So there's some realism to it.
Plus, and here's another very important thing, is that Gettysburg, the scope is very limited. It's just the Battle of Gettysburg.
Basically like a week.
Yeah.
And really, most of the movie focuses on the 3 days of Gettysburg, as it should.
But whereas this movie, Gods and Generals, is all over the place. It's the first couple years of the Civil War, and it's just totally slapshot, and it jumps between characters, and it jumps between battles without any rhyme or reason.
And it uses a lot of the same people are in it.
Yeah.
But not always in playing the same individuals, which gets confusing.
Yeah. So an excellent actor, Stephen Lang, is in this movie and also Gettysburg. In Gettysburg, he played Pickett.
In this movie, he's Stonewall Jackson.
And
then General Pickett shows up in this movie, and you're like,
wait a second. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing is actually Stephen Lang, his acting is not bad in this movie.
Not at all.
Like, it's not like hammy. It's not over the top. Like, his acting isn't bad. It's not like Oscar worthy, but he doesn't do a bad job as Stonewall Jackson.
But it's just the material is not ideal.
Yeah. Well, let's get into this. Let's start dissecting this film.
So the movie starts, and it starts off with a real good sign. It says a Ted Turner production in big letters.
That's right. Always a good sign.
A Ron Maxwell film, and then an Antietam Filmworks production, which I don't think has ever done anything else but this.
Oh, I thought they did Blade Trinity.
Oh, right. Of course. How could I have forgotten? Yeah. They did that too.
Yeah. So
And we get like a montage of a bunch of Civil War flags while music is playing.
yeah, and they're flags of some famous units: 20th Maine, which is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's unit, and some other stuff.
3rd Arkansas.
The 3rd Arkansas, which was in the Texas Brigade,
Huh.
is in John Bell Hood's.
Wait, so the Arkansas Regiment is in the Texas Brigade?
Yeah, well, because they were the only regiments from Texas and Arkansas, so they just combined one Arkansas regiment and 3 Texas regiments, and they all combined it into one Western Brigade.
Didn't like during the Civil War they had like the Army of Mississippi and it became the Army of Tennessee or something like that?
Yes, so armies changed names. Well, we think of like the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Theater, but there was the Army of the James. There was the Army of Virginia for the Union. The Union tended to name armies after rivers, the South after locations. So there was the Army of the Tennessee in the West, where there was just the Army of Tennessee, which is what the Confederates had.
And it's the Tennessee River that they're naming it after.
Yes, the Tennessee
Union
River,
is.
yeah. So yeah, stuff like that.
But a nice intro.
Yeah, it's fine. And then
What comes next, though? Is
Robert E. Lee shows up.
he's sitting in a carriage being like very slowly taken down the street.
Yes. And may we say that you watched the director's cut, which is
did.
like how long? 4.5 hours?
I think it's 4 hours and 40 minutes, I think is how long it is.
And that's
insane.
one of the things about this movie is it is so long.
It's ridiculously long. And it's not long because it's packed with content. It's long for no good reason. There's interminable scenes of like just garbage. Especially like so there's a bunch of scenes with John Wilkes Booth in this movie. It's like John Wilkes Booth as an actor saying these Shakespeare lines in these goofy costumes, standing up on a stage, and the lines are supposed to like correspond to what's happening in the Civil War. And it's just it has nothing to do with anything.
And so the editors thought that as well, because none of those scenes made it into the theatrical cut.
Good on you, whoever edited this movie.
Corky Ellers, actually.
Corky. Oh, that's right. Okay.
We saw at the beginning.
Yeah, we rewatched key parts of this movie a little while ago. But oh god,
Oh god! So it is just interminable. I think that's the best word. It's just, and they're not action scenes. It's just these talking. And I know that talking is important in a movie, but
It
there
can be
can be
great.
such a thing as too much of a good thing.
Well, the talking is not a good thing in this movie most of the time. Most of the time, it's super boring with really long pauses for no reason. And awkward silences are filled in by the score desperately trying to have like a theme to what's going on.
I know. I liked how you watched it. What speed were we watching it at?
A lot of it was at 1.75.
And that was pretty
times.
funny.
Yeah.
It was actually kind of funny.
Which, you know, if you're watching like a really great film, you shouldn't do that. It messes up the pacing. The pacing is terrible in this film already, so you don't have to, it doesn't really detract very much.
Some things like it speeds through, and other things is whoa.
Molasses.
Molasses. Yeah, I should have said molasses. I'm sorry, I've got Manassas on the brain.
Your brain has become addled. Oh,
Yeah, I know.
It's become addlebirded.
Yeah.
Oh no.
So yeah, Robert E. Lee, and this shows the scene where Robert E. Lee is still in the Union Army, and it's April of 1861, and he goes and meets with this guy, Francis Preston Blair, who is this kind of influential, like newspaper editor, kind of involved in the government, but not really, who offers him command of the Union Army, which is something that Robert E. Lee was offered. And old Roberto declines because he can't turn against the state of Virginia.
That's right, yeah.
And
because in the movie, the Virginian secession meeting or whatever to discuss whether they'll leave the Union is happening that very day. And you see Robert E. Lee edit later on that day. So he's like, I can't accept this because I might have to fight my own state pretty soon.
Which is kind of a weird thing to think in this modern era, someone being like, I can't possibly fight against people from my fellow state of Delaware. It's interesting how like state ties have declined, because it's just weird. That's like, probably I'm sure there's children today, and when they learn about this in their American history class, they're like, why? Whatever state I live in, I don't care about Illinois or Florida or California or New Mexico or whatever enough to fight against it.
Have you seen the film Edge of Tomorrow?
I have. I think they changed the name to something else.
Live, Die, Repeat is what they changed it to. There's a character in there where it's like, you're American, aren't you? And he says, no, I'm from Tennessee.
That's Bill Paxton.
That's
isn't
Bill
it?
Paxton, yeah. But like you were saying, the whole like loyalty to a state being higher than loyalty to the government, isn't there like a legal classification for treason against states of the Union.
Well, there's treason is a federal crime, and it's actually talked about in the Constitution because you have to have at least 2 witnesses. But many states have a charge of treason against that state. So it's like, how does one commit treason against the state of Nebraska? I don't know. Like, it's like, you're illegally shipping corn to Iowa. Like, you've committed treason. You're going to be shot at high noon in the square in Lincoln. It's like, is not a treason against a state necessarily treason against I don't think of any state that I could think of that has ever charged someone with treason against that state in particular.
Well, maybe they did during the Civil War, but who knows?
Well, yeah. John Brown was charged with treason against Virginia, and that's what he was executed for.
Huh.
But I'm talking modern era.
Right, exactly. Did you know that Lincoln and Jefferson Davis from the same state?
They were born like 100 miles apart. Yeah, they're both from Kentucky.
Kentucky.
Lincoln was born in Hardin County, Kentucky. And I've actually been to his birthplace.
Really?
They have, well, it's not the original cabin, but right where he's supposedly born. And they also have supposedly a clipping from the plant that a cow ate from that then gave milk that his mother died from.
What?
And I was like maybe 10 or 11 at the time. And they're like, this is the plant, the milkweed that this cow ate, and his mother died of milk sickness or whatever from drinking it. And I almost asked the ranger, like, how are you sure?
How do you know this?
Like, so did the Lincoln family preserve this? Like, this is the root that killed our mother. We're going to hold on to it?
We're going to need this for the Lincoln Presidential Library many years from now.
Exactly.
Centuries from now.
Yeah, it was strange. But they do have a replica of the cabin that he was born in, but it wasn't the original one because the original one actually apparently still existed around the Civil War, and then someone decided to take it on a tour, so they disassembled it, and then they just like left the lumber in a yard and it rotted, or something like that. But point is, getting back to this Francis Preston Blair offers him this command, and he declines, which he does, and eventually Lee joins the Confederacy. But it's interesting because the man who plays Francis Preston Blair, he looks kind of like Winfield Scott,
who
was the General Union commander at the time, came up with the Anaconda Plan and all that. But if you look at a real picture of Francis Preston Blair, it doesn't look so good.
Yeah, he looks like a reanimated corpse. He looks like a hollow from Dark Souls or something. He looks terrible.
Oh my God. But and as you were noting, that this scene may be confusing for people who don't really know about the Civil War that much.
There's no context at all to this. Like, if somebody who just vaguely knows things about the Civil War is just going to be totally confused.
And they don't even call it Washington, D.C. They call it Washington City.
Washington
As
City.
if that was something that's like calling like a hamburger sandwich. Like, really.
I'm not sure if we mentioned this in the Man in the High Castle episode, but like the nuked out version of Washington, D.C. is called the District of Contamination.
Yes.
So silly. So dumb.
So obviously more buildup because this movie is a lot of buildup.
A lot of buildup, yeah.
And you meet Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, as he's teaching at VMI, and he's lecturing his students about how they don't understand what's going on. So he's going to repeat the lesson the next day, word for word.
Word for word.
Which is something that he actually did in real life.
Yeah. And like people would ask him a question and he would just like rewind the lecture to the part and then just say exactly what he said before.
Yeah. He was called Tom Fool Jackson. Like his students like hated him. Like, they kind of portray, although actually, no, I don't want to say, I want to give the movie props. It doesn't necessarily portray him as beloved by his students. Because he wasn't, because people really didn't like him that much because they thought he was like crazy.
His students are just stone-faced, just looking at him as he tells them they have to do the exact same thing again tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it's interrupted because secession occurs during this lecture. Like the cadets are taking down the American flag and then replacing it with, I guess, this Confederate flag that they made or something.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like the Stars and Bars, not like the Confederate battle flag that everyone knows. It's the Stars and Bars. That's the official flag of the Confederacy.
Just makes you wonder who's the Betsy Ross of this flag, who made this flag. I don't know either.
But and then you have people arguing about secession and blah, blah, blah. And this one guy is Jackson Aide, so they're hanging out. And
Sandy Pendleton.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think you make a good point. People just show up sometimes, and there's like a little thing underneath, like this is who they are, and you're like later in the Fredericksburg scene, it's just like this is Provost Marshal General Marcena Patrick or something, and he says like a line, and then he just rides away, and that's it.
He's like, what does he say? He says, "You're an army, not a mob," or something like that.
This is an army, not a rabble.
Yeah.
And then they just says that, and then boop, gone. Never to see or seen or heard from again.
He died on his way back to his home planet.
And then like they enlist Jackson to And we're not going to go through every part of this movie. We're just
no.
going through the important parts. He takes over this brigade of Virginia regiments and he's training them. And then at one point you do see these soldiers marching. And I do want to comment on this is like they're dressed in like tricorn hats, like Revolutionary War stuff. And I remember you pointed out, you're like, what's up with that? What WTF? But so here's the thing is it captures walls. Obviously the Confederacy never had, they call it the blue and the gray, but the Confederacy never had standardized uniforms. And even the Union didn't really, more so. But the Confederacy never had the resources to give everyone the standard gray uniform you think about. And units, especially at the beginning of the war, often wore the uniforms they had. And there were some militia units, and I've read about this, who were dressed up in Revolutionary War clothes. And some people, they just wore whatever they had in the Union. Sometimes they wore different uniforms, a little bit more standardized. You had the Zouave units.
Yeah. I remember learning about those as a little kid visiting a Civil War museum. So crazy with their big, ridiculous pants and
big red shirts that say, shoot me right here.
Right here, yes.
I'm right
I would
here.
like to die, please.
Yeah.
They're kepis. Like, well, I guess everybody wears kepis.
Not everyone, because a lot of the Southern soldiers wore what they called like slouch hats, which were like broader brim hats. And there were some Union units that wore similar, especially out west. Because when we think of like the standard kepi and blue uniform, that's Army of Potomac. Like out west, clothing, because the supply lines were not as good, clothing was a little bit more varied. But it does show something accurately. Jackson at the Battle of First Bull Run, which you see, and we're calling it Bull Run.
Yes, that's
not
right.
Manassas.
Yes. Because we love that train station so much. Or what is it named
It's
after?
Bull Run Creek, and then Manassas
the river.
is the town.
Oh my God. So sorry.
No worries. But Jackson in it wears a blue army uniform, and there are troops that wear blue uniforms. And that's something like some people will be like, what's going on here? Well, that's actually accurate for the time. That the blue uniforms thing changed, but the wide variety of uniforms did not. So, and also came to weapons too. So like the primary weapons were percussion cap rifles, rifled muskets. So Springfield on the Union side, and then Enfield primarily for the Confederates, although Enfields were also used by the Union and captured Springfields by the Confederacy. And then sometimes a 69 caliber smoothbore musket. But also people said at the beginning of the Civil War that they saw people armed with like Brown Bess muskets that were like Revolutionary War era. People would show up with just shotguns.
Well, because it's like your family gun.
Yeah.
It's like, here's the household gun, and I'm going to walk to war by myself because there's going to be a battle over there.
Because don't you worry, soon we're getting AK-47s. We're getting an upgrade.
The Rivington men are coming.
Yeah, that's right.
Rudy and Benny Lang and all these people. Yeah.
Oh, God, yeah.
I've been rereading that book. It's good.
That's not bad.
It's not bad.
They should make a show out of it.
They really could.
That'd be funny. And then as this training montage goes through, and this is something to comment on later, is that there's when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain finally shows up an hour into this movie.
To be fair, this is the extended edition.
Yes,
but still
an hour.
That's insane. Your other protagonist.
He's top billed. Jeff Daniels is top billed in this movie. And if you watch this version, he doesn't show up until an hour in.
Oh my God.
But there's a lot of drilling, and it's like, oh, this is boring. Well, It is boring. It is like boring for a movie, but actually realistic how important drilling actually was in reality. But Jeb Stuart shows up in this movie too.
That's right.
I've been talking a lot, so I'll let you.
Jeb ! Is in this film. He has the world's worst fake beard. It looks so terrible. Absolutely terrible.
It looks like it's about to fall off.
Yeah. Yeah, we get introduced to Jeb Stuart, the famous cavalry commander. He's got a big, ridiculous hat with feathers on it, and he talks with Stonewall Jackson, and Stonewall Jackson just has this scene where he talks about the black flag. We must show them the black flag. Look to the Bible. The Bible has many such wars as this one.
No quarter.
Give no quarter to the enemy. Stephen Lang is great. He's so good.
But it's just goofy. And it does... One thing that it doesn't play on fully, and many people accused it of whitewashing for the Confederacy, and we'll address that in a little bit, but it shows Jackson as kind of, very serious about religion, kind of a, maybe not the most normal person, but, he's relatively within the boundaries, not the like complete weirdo he was in real life.
Like even at the time, people commented on how strange and idiosyncratic this guy was.
Yeah. Very religious, hyper-religious, in like a hypochondriac. He would stand ramrod straight because he didn't want his organs to come out of alignment.
Yeah, if he was in a chair with a back, he wouldn't let his back touch the chair back for that same reason. He wouldn't eat pepper.
He thought pepper made his legs feel weak.
Yeah, well, just one of his legs. I think like his left leg. Yeah.
He sucked on lemons a lot. He was weird. I mean, he was a strange guy.
Hold his hand up in the air.
Yeah, and interestingly enough is that he's been played up as this real genius in this movie, assuredly. But
yeah, I mean, the movie's basically about him.
Yeah, he is the main character.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where he was up and down as a commander. Like, his successes were really smashing successes, but when he was off his game. And this movie ignores what made him famous, which is, yeah, he got the name, there stands Jackson like a stone wall.
At Manassas.
Manassas. But he becomes famous in the South for his campaign in the Shenandoah Valley in early 1862. That's what makes him famous. And this movie doesn't talk about that one iota.
Totally skips it. It goes from, well, gosh, yeah, because in this version that we watched, it went from Bull Run to Antietam.
Mm-hmm. And the theatrical goes straight to Fredericksburg.
Completely skips Antietam. Mm-hmm. All the Antietam scenes totally cut. So you never saw a single
No, and
frame.
The Antietam scenes, actually having watched them, are actually not half bad. Well, some of them aren't half bad. Like, scenes in the cornfield are pretty good.
Yeah. There's corn. There you go. Boom.
Yeah, boom. You got
Mission accomplished.
So this movie does show the Battle of First Bull Run, the first major battle of the war in the East, at least. You see Jackson, and at one point he gets hit by, it was actually a spent round in real life, but it looks like a paintballer shot him.
What do you mean by a spent round?
Like, it was not a direct hit. It was like a round that may have hit the ground and like bounced up and hit him in the hand. So it wasn't like a full, a direct shot. And then you see General Bernard B. give him the name. He says, "Oh, there stands Jackson like a stone wall." Although there's some people in real life, I think we addressed this on another episode, who think that may have been more an insult.
You're supposed to be moving and you're standing like a stone wall instead.
Yeah. They show the victory in First Manassas or whatever. But there's some stuff about it that they don't show, which is, there's some interesting facts. First of all, they should have included the fact that there were picnickers who actually watched First Bull Run.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Civilians that wanted to come see the battle of the Civil War. Some people thought there'd be one battle and it'd be over.
Yeah.
So let's go watch it. The spectacle. And then when the Union starts retreating, they're encountering all these civilians that are in the way.
And if they'd stuck that in there, I guarantee you people would have been like, that's not very realistic. But it's true. And then also, B actually gets killed and all that. But it doesn't show the Union General, Irvin McDowell.
Oh, it doesn't. That's very true. What an interesting character. I was reading about the Civil War. I was listening to a lecture thing. And interesting fact about this man, he ate an entire watermelon. He said, "Hey, officers, want to see something cool?" And then brought in a watermelon and then just ate literally the entire thing, including the seeds and the rind. Just chomping into this totally tasteless, disgusting melon flesh. If only Youtube existed back then, he could have had a great career, Unfortunately, he was consigned to being a mediocre Civil War general.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and so Bull Run ends, but I think you point out too in the notes, that doesn't explain why this is important.
Yeah.
And then it just skips forward to Antietam, which is skipping some hugely important battles. Shiloh, the 7 Days Campaign, the Shenandoah Valley, Second Bull Run, all these things.
Yeah. So many things in the West. You mentioned Shiloh. That was a huge defeat for the Confederacy. I believe that was in Missouri, correct?
Tennessee in April of 1862. U.S. Grant.
Unconditional surrender grant. Simon Bolivar Buckner, That's right. But those defeats in the West were what made the Anaconda Plan possible. Yes. And eventually were the death knell of the Confederacy. But this film, which let's say has a moderate Confederate bias, doesn't really want to dwell on those Confederate defeats. They want to glorify the victories, which is, that's just an aspect of this film. That is just how it is,
Yeah, no, and it shows, so it skips forward. But it not only does that, but it also shows, this is when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain shows up, and he was a teacher at Bowdoin College in Maine.
That's right, yeah.
But it's supposed to be a prequel, but Jeff Daniels looks a little bit older and a little bit heftier,
larger,
than he did,
Oh man, it is. I do kind of feel bad for him a little bit. in this movie. He's not in good shape.
He isn't. It almost is like they came to him at the last second. They're like, they didn't want him in the movie, and at the last second, like, oh, we need you. And he didn't like have time to like lose some weight or.
There's like a scene where he's got an undershirt on that he almost looks good in it, but then there's other scenes where he looks absolutely terrible. So maybe they brought him in for reshoots or something, and he just
not holding up so well.
fell off the wagon or something.
And then his brother, played by C. Thomas Howell, shows up.
He's back.
That's right. Tom, everyone's favorite character in the movie Gettysburg.
Dan, Butterfield. See, here in this regiment, we got our own bugle calls. What a film.
Yeah. And then there's Adelbert Ames shows up, and that's the first commander of the 20th Maine before Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And Adelbert Ames actually won a Medal of Honor at the Battle of Bull Run, and interestingly enough was the second to last living Civil War general.
Really?
He died at the age of like 97 or 98 in like 1935 or something like that.
Oh my God.
So
He's quite young in this movie.
he is. Well, yeah, because he was at the time.
Yeah.
But he shows up.
He's got a ridiculous Boston accent.
Yeah, the guy playing him, they're like, turn that Boston accent up as far as you possibly can. Far as you possibly can.
Mark Wahlberg levels of accent.
Yes,
Just push
please.
it.
But he does a lot of the drilling instructing, which is important, which is good.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I don't want to fault this movie for showing what really is important, which is you just don't enlist people and then you go to war unless it's Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
You know, you have to train them, and like this is important. And drilling was a very important part to this day. Drilling is important, but especially if they were going to march in unison and all that and things like that.
It's not like cool in a movie to show people drilling. It's important. It is boring, of course, but you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. But then you get to the Battle of Antietam, which Chamberlain doesn't actually fight in.
That's right. They're in reserve the entire time, and they do nothing.
They do nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
And they also give the date of the Battle of Antietam as September 19th.
Yes.
Not true, September 17th.
There's also some very, very, very bad CGI in this battle scene. Like, clearly it's unfinished. They did not finish this portion of the film, and they just wanted to include it in the director's cut just because they spent all this money on battle stuff.
Oh, yeah. The whole Antietam thing, just gone. General McClellan shows up in it, all that.
Yeah. He's so young looking.
Yeah, well, he was, because he was. But,
Yeah.
then we move on to, after that, Fredericksburg.
Now, I mean, to be fair, though, between that and Fredericksburg is a lot of time, a lot of fluff, and
There's a lot of John Wilkes Booth stuff
yes,
at
so
that
much.
point.
So much. Like, it's so funny. Like, Lincoln says, we're going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't do it immediately, but he, like, said, I'm going to do this. Instead of this being, like, a big scene where some freedman, like Frederick Douglass or whatever, is like, yes, this is great. Good old Lincoln. Instead, we get John Wilkes Booth just complaining about it and saying, this man is a tyrant. And then moving on. And then briefly, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain talks about it later. But it's like, this is a big deal, you know,
Yeah.
in your Civil War movie. One of the few things everybody knows about the Civil War.
And Antietam, that's why Antietam is so important.
You could almost make an entire movie about Antietam.
They should. But these days, I don't feel like Civil War movies are.
Yeah, they're less in the public consciousness, and you don't have a huge reenactment fan base that you can call on to be in your movie for free, like you could back in the 90s and early 2000s.
They still exist, but I think it is falling out of the main. Not out of the main. It's just not as popular anymore.
Right, right. Like Ken Burns' Civil War era is like the zenith of Civil War fandom. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, probably. Well, because there was a whole bunch of stuff. You had the Civil War came out in 1990, and then you had the movie Gettysburg and stuff like that, and there was just a general interest in it. I mean, there always will be an interest in the American Civil War, but I feel like there was more in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's kind of 20 years have passed by, and perhaps we're focusing more on World War I and World War II, given the centenary, and also this is sort of the last era of World War II veterans and stuff like that. So people focus more on that than on a bygone era.
It's also a more relatable form of warfare rather than, you know, the Civil War style.
Yeah, and the Civil War, and the farther you get away from an event, it's harder to understand the motivations. And, you know, there are people who, well, I know someone who secondhand knew people were in the Civil War. This person also actually knew someone who was a living witness to the bombardment of Fort Sumter.
Wow.
But those people are getting fewer and far between. But yes, this person knew someone during their lifetime, and they knew and talked with them, and it was actually a family member who was a living witness to the bombardment of Fort Sumter.
That's what I hear, is that once you get beyond 3 generations, the historical connection disappears.
Yeah.
Like you just don't have that personal connection.
And that's why it's important for us to preserve what we can of World War II, because the World War I era we're getting closer to that. I mean, like, I know my parents knew people who were born in the 1800s, not a lot, but certainly they knew people. I know at least one person, again, that same person I was talking about earlier, whose father was born in the 1800s. If we move farther away, at least there's some secondhand, World War I. And it wasn't that long ago. 2012 was the last World War I veteran, so it wasn't outrageous.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still World War II veterans, but, we think about World War II as the greatest war of all time, and probably in a sense it is. Mm-hmm. But if you told somebody in the late 1600s how disruptive was the 30 Years' War, I mean, it was a world war to them.
Yeah.
But to us, that's just stuff in a book.
People who were born from a camp follower, grew up, became a mercenary, and then fought in the same war that was happening years before they were even born. Mm-hmm. And then they grow up to be like a full-grown man and then retire. And the war is still going on. And it's just, it's insanity.
Yeah.
It's insane to even think about.
And it's crazy, but we don't have that sort of access. Although the Civil War, there's a little bit better because there actually are some recorded interviews with Civil War veterans. The last Civil War veteran died in 1956. Mm-hmm. So that's well within living memory. There's people alive today who certainly could probably remember meeting. I mean, I met somebody when I toured Gettysburg now almost 20 years ago. They had like these tour guides who would come in your car and tour around. And we got this old guy, and he was talking about how he had gone when he was a child to the 75th anniversary of Gettysburg, which was the last great Civil War reunion. So he met Union and Confederate soldiers who had been in Pickett's charge. I mean, I don't know if that guy, I hope he's still alive. He may not be, because this was almost 20 years ago. But that sort of connection still kind of exists. And it's going away. And so the Civil War is a little bit more accessible, but still it's not kind of the in thing.
Right. It's not cool.
No. But it is interesting and it's important to remember.
I mean, it is cool, but it's not like really...
It's not in vogue.
It's not in vogue, precisely, yes.
And maybe given the way people think about some stuff today, as it raises questions about people's attitudes, even in the North, towards certain things. Not exactly PC, you could say.
Yeah, it's not like everyone in the North was like, we must fight this war to save slaves and emancipate everyone.
No,
it's
not
like,
really.
No, not at all.
No, that was not. Mm-hmm. I think people have a tough time because the war was about slavery.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. There were people certainly against it, but, not to the level that you would think. Mm-hmm. So
the only people who wanted emancipation as a war goal were radical Republican abolitionists at the beginning of the war. Those are the only people.
And they gained more power as the war went on.
Oh,
and the movie Lincoln does a good job of showing that.
That movie's good.
It is a good movie. Not really a Civil War movie, as you pointed out earlier.
Yeah.
When we were talking before we started recording.
I sat down. I didn't know anything about the movie. I thought it was going to be, here's Lincoln's life starting in the Black Hawk War, or him as a lawyer or whatever, and then he becomes a politician, and then, oh no, the Civil War. No, not at all. The movie is a very, very specific scope. The 13th Amendment.
Tommy Lee Jones is in it.
Tommy Lee Jones is Thaddeus Stevens, and he's completely bald, as in real life in that movie. He takes his wig off at the end. There's a funny story about Thaddeus Stevens where back in those days, it was kind of a thing where you go up to people you admire. You'd say, can I have a lock of your hair? And some woman came up to him and asked for a lock of his, and he took his wig off and said, have them all, madam. And here they are.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah, not bad.
But back to the movie. Then you get to Fredericksburg, and this is where the movie really gets. It's interesting.
Quite a lot of the running time is Fredericksburg.
It's Fredericksburg. Actually, a lot of it's Fredericksburg plus the time in between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Oh my God! Talk about pulling the drag chute. Just
yeah, just so this movie's moving too fast. We've still got another 3 hours to work with, because I think you noted when it starts, the Fredericksburg part starts at 1 hour and 45 minutes, which is there's 3 more hours to go in this movie, guys. We need to get it nice and slow and steady.
So some background about Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg is the midpoint between Washington and Richmond. This was the first real battle under Burnside, isn't that correct?
After McClellan was relieved after Antietam, Ambrose Burnside, and we do in fact get the word sideburns from Burnside, took over. And basically attacked. And Fredericksburg also sits at a very important point because it sits on the Rappahannock River, right near the intersection with the Rapidan River. And Virginia is just a series of horizontal rivers that are just a block to any invader. So it's a very important crossing because it's also to go through Fredericksburg, and behind it is to get around what's called the Wilderness, where there's a lot of fighting in 1863 in Chancellorsville, and then 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness, which is pretty impassable. So it's a way around it towards Richmond.
And the best place to cross in this river is right on this city, Fredericksburg. It's just the best crossing place. So they have to cross into this urban area.
Don't worry, there's a whole scene where Winfield Scott Hancock and this other guy who we don't know go along into it. And Winfield Scott Hancock, I will say, the guy who played him in Gettysburg, he does a pretty good job. He kind of looks like Winfield Scott Hancock, but like he's kind of a short, pudgier guy. And Winfield Scott Hancock was very famous for the fact that he was quite tall and like equestrian and very, he actually ran for president against Garfield.
What?
Yeah, Winfield Scott Hancock. Yeah, and almost won.
For the Democrats?
Yeah, for the Democrats.
Interesting.
But back to this. So there's Fredericksburg, and he talks about how we're going to get murdered trying to cross, and then trying to build pontoon bridges, and then they do build these pontoon bridges, and they have Union troops in these little boats trying to shoot at the Confederates,
tiny,
and the Confederates are
crappy.
just shooting them up, which is actually real. Like that's a pretty realistic.
And then they go into the city. In the city, there's like flanking stuff and people shooting from hills and windows.
One of the few times you see actually urban warfare in a Civil War movie, which is actually pretty good because it did happen, not a ton. But
Yeah, like for instance, when the Confederates took Washington, D.C., remember when that happened with their AK-47s?
Oh, yeah, that's right, of course, yeah.
They had their rifle grenades that helped them out.
But there is a scene as the people are fleeing out of Fredericksburg. There's this family that you kind of see earlier that shows up, and this lady... She, there was a lot of allegations thrown around that this movie was pro-Confederacy. And this scene did not do a whole lot to
dissuade
them, especially when she goes, God, give them the victory.
Give them the strength to overcome.
Yeah. And I did think it was funny. Apparently, when this movie was reviewed by Roger Ebert, he said if they'd handled World War II in the same way, there'd be hell to pay. Which is amazing. Which is totally true.
Did you know that Attack of the Clones, when George Lucas was writing it, he took a lot of inspiration from the American Civil War when he made Attack of the Clones. Like Count Dooku is supposed to be Robert E. Lee.
Is he?
Yeah.
Oh.
You can see the resemblance.
That's right.
Christopher Lee.
When he ignited his lightsaber in this movie and jumped in and was cutting down all the Union troops.
And started spinning around. There's heroes on both sides of this conflict.
That's right. Well, and here's the thing about the Robert E. Lee, and I think we mentioned this in another episode, is that this is one improvement, is that Robert Duvall, he does a fine job, not outstanding, but he does a fine job. He looks like Robert E. Lee.
Yes.
And he also is actually apparently related to him in real life.
Are you for real?
Yeah, apparently he's somehow
goodness.
related. But he actually looks like Robert E. Lee a little bit more than Martin Sheen looks like Robert E. Lee.
Martin Sheen looks ridiculous in that movie. There's a scene where he's like rallying the soldiers and he looks terrified, surrounded by all these reenactors. It's like wide eyes. Oh.
And we totally forgot to mention this at the beginning of the book. Gods and Generals is a prequel written by Jeff Shara to the book The Killer Angels, which inspired the movie Gettysburg, which was written by his father, Michael Shara, who died actually before even Gettysburg was made.
Interesting.
And I do have an interesting connection to that, which is someone I know knew Michael Shara when he was alive and actually helped edit the book, like some of the initial drafts, which is really interesting, I thought.
Okay.
So this person actually knew him, like, sort of personally.
I think you said that he suggested some changes.
I think he did. And I don't know the extent of those changes, but he certainly was involved in it. And when this person told me that, I was stunned because I never expected that. But they're like, yeah, no, I actually was somewhat involved. I knew, I was like, oh, wow.
And that book was kind of a big deal.
It won a Pulitzer.
A Pulitzer, for goodness
Gods
sakes.
and Generals did not
win
a Pulitzer. And then he also made The Last Full Measure, which is the sequel to Gettysburg about the 1864 campaign, I guess.
Have you read it?
I have not. No.
Okay.
No. But so let's get back. We're getting in classic Talkernate history form, getting on tangents. But so Fredericksburg, there also is a scene. Why don't you explain this, Max? The scene with Stonewall and a cook in the army.
Oh dear. So we've been introduced to this man Jim. He is a cook for the Confederate Army, and he's a black man, and I believe he is actually a slave. He has a friend who is a freedman who is also a cook. And at one point, he meets up with Stonewall Jackson, and they pray together. And Stonewall Jackson is like, yeah, I don't know, like maybe one day there will be emancipation or something, whatever, at some point. And like he seems cautiously optimistic by then. And it's like, you would not see a scene like this if there was a movie made today.
No, you would not.
Very different. This is an attempt to reconcile Stonewall Jackson because in real life he was pro-slavery, trying to rehabilitate him a little bit with this movie, with stuff that's maybe not 100% realistic.
And that was part of what people really, really did not like about this movie.
Yeah, the clear Confederate bias is the main reason. Well, I wouldn't say the main reason because the movie is deeply flawed in many ways, but that is a huge criticism of the film, is that like the Confederates are the good guys, 100%. And Lincoln and the Union Army is either bad guys or like
a bunch of rabble-rousing, like, fools.
Yeah, there's like a scene where a bunch of Zouaves in Fredericksburg are like, yeah, woo,
yeah,
running around like playing piano.
Well, they kind of like play it off as the Southerners are just simple farmers defending their land and their people, while the Northerners are a bunch of like, the rabble city folk. Yeah. And there's Stonewall Jackson goes on a rant about factories at one point.
Yes. If what does he say? If the Yankees are triumphant, it will mean the triumph of commerce over human dignity or something like that. The bankers.
That's right. I'd much rather live in crushing poverty.
Big Bernie Sanders fan, Stonewall Jackson.
But then you have the actual Battle of Fredericksburg. And actually, pretty much to real life, it shows how much of a slaughter it was, is that the Union troops just march headlong into the Confederate lines at Marye's Heights.
They have to run over this crappy little creek, over these little wooden bridges.
Which is true.
Yeah.
And just one-sided slaughter.
Yeah, there's like the Confederates are behind a stone wall and are just chewing them to pieces. But in the movie, there's like an Irish regiment and an Irish regiment that come together and fight each other. That I don't know if that really happened.
Well, there was an Irish brigade in the Union Army. I think there were some Irish units in the Confederate Army, but not an Irish regiment. And they have these very hilarious Irish accents. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm not going to try it. So it's like...
Don't they know we're fighting for our independence now?
Just like against the English,
Just like against the English. Like, there's not that many Irish people in the Confederacy. If anything, it's the North that's the Irish.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly.
Contingent.
But you see, like, the Irish brigades get shot up, and then some guy, it's like, here's Samuel Zook's brigade. It's like, they also get shot up.
Remember him? Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
The whole theater breaks out into applause. Yay!
Finally, Colonel Zook has arrived.
We were talking about Irish people. I've heard a statistic, and I'm not sure if this was true, but that a third of Union citizens were foreign born, not even born in the United States.
I don't know about that, but a significant portion. Actually, there were more Germans who served in the U.S. Army, the Union Army, I guess the U.S. Army, than Irish. But Irish were a substantial portion, and certainly because they were big in Philadelphia and New York and Boston, where they were voting cities. So a lot of Irish representation and all that.
Yeah, there's that guy with the glasses. What's his name? The German commander.
Karl Schurz.
Karl Schurz, yeah. What an interesting looking guy.
Yeah.
Veteran of the 1848 revolution.
Yeah, revolution. And then he became big in the American Civil War.
A political general, not really.
Yeah, he was not bad. Some of them were more political. But yeah, no. So Fredericksburg, and then you have Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain finally making his triumphant entry into battle. And he gives Maxwell, what would you describe it as?
Just a completely ridiculous speech, just totally over the top. I believe he's quoting something from Julius Caesar.
Yeah, the Shakespeare play.
Yeah, and he's like, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. We who are about to die salute you."
And you're like, what is this?
What is going on?
And then they're like, okay, it's time to go forward, men. And they like rush forward. And then you see the part where they're slowly trudging over the bridge. And it's like, and then they
gingerly walking across
and they
this
just
plank.
get shot to pieces. Again, like very many units did at Fredericksburg, which was a huge Union disaster.
Yeah.
So it did accurately capture that. Burnside shows up, and he's just like an idiot. And then, of course, comes the real fun part, the in-between Fredericksburg to Chancellorsville part of this movie that is just...
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, as you put it, oh boy, time for Confederate Christmas.
There's lots of scenes of people reading letters and people like reminiscing about stuff. There's a pretty crazy Christmas scene where like Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee and a bunch of other generals, William Pendleton and Sandy Pendleton, they all meet up and they sing Christmas carols, and it goes on and on and on, and it's just unbelievable. It's crazy.
And then Stonewall Jackson becomes friend with this little girl,
Jane, I believe her name is, and he gives like another just completely ridiculous scene. He gives her a piggyback ride, and it's like, it's like, you're not even related to this woman.
Why is this 40-some-year-old man hanging out with this young girl?
I don't know. And like he has a scene where like gives her a piece of braid to wear around her head, and there's like they have lemonade. He's like, that's not too sweet. Very good. May I have another? Oh a lemon reference because he loved lemons.
That's right. And then you have Robert E. Lee doing this weird smiling thing at some point.
Yeah, there's I think it's actually before Bull Run, but he's like talking to his generals, and then at some point I guess he like adjusts his mouth, but it looks like he's smiling. It's just the world's goofiest smile. Because Robert E. Lee is not a smiley guy. He doesn't do a lot of smiling.
No.
He's
but
very
you have
austere.
Yeah, and then you just have these scenes, and then of course this girl catches a fever and then dies, and then people are like, "Oh my goodness!" And then there's actually a scene though that is surprisingly realistic, where like a Confederate picket and a Union picket, like a scout kind of, they're watching each other. They like exchange food and stuff like that.
Oh my God!
But that is very realistic because that actually did happen.
That happens all the time in Turtle Dove books, where like two enemy sides will meet and be like in the Southern Victory series. Oh, I like that corned beef hash. I'll trade you this for my Havana cigar and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh my God, over and over again.
And then there's also a great scene, the Bonnie Blue Flag scene. Oh, yes.
There's like a performance by, I guess, a bunch of Texas actors or something. Mm-hmm. So there's a little skit where a guy plays Lincoln and a lady plays Mary Todd Lincoln, and it looks a lot more attractive than the real Mary Todd Lincoln.
Way more attractive.
Whoa. And then afterwards, they all celebrate and they sing the Bonnie Blue Flag, which is a good song. I like the song. It's a very catchy tune. But you this is like 3 hours and 40 minutes into the film.
And there's a scene, though. Ted Turner makes his beloved appearance in this movie.
That's right. It's Colonel Patton.
Now he says to John Bell, he's like, you Texas boys sure know how to put on a good time.
Yes. And then the other guy just nods. Uh-huh.
Right. Can we have some more money, please?
Thank you for making this entire film, Ted. I really appreciate it.
We got to get our Ted time in before he gets shot in the next movie.
Yeah. Did Colonel Patton die at Gettysburg?
Yeah, the character he plays actually was killed.
Interesting. Okay.
It was like an uncle of the Patton, George C. Scott, I mean.
Yes, of course. Right. Right.
But yeah, the Bonnie Blue Flag scene is just crazy, and they're all dancing and singing, and you can see that they're all like Stephen Lang as Stonewall's trying to get into it a little bit, and all these other people are like belting it out, and Robert Duvall is clearly like, yeah, oh wait, why am I in this movie? Bonnie Blue Flag, yeah.
We are a band of brothers, native to the soil, fighting for our property that was won with honest toil. Property meaning slaves, by the way.
Yeah. So as you can see, again, why people had kind of a problem with this. And frankly, I know 2003 was somewhat of a different time, but they were a little tone deaf.
Yeah, with this film, yeah. I mean, I don't know. If you were going to make a Civil War movie, you should not demonize everyone who is a Confederate.
That's true. You shouldn't.
You really shouldn't. It's not like... People have a tendency to put like some Nazi SS mass murderer and a Confederate soldier on the same level. And that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's completely incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
but, and then as we... this movie's still rolling on.
Yeah.
Eventually we get to Chancellorsville.
Chancellorsville, yeah. Another smashing Confederate victory.
Indeed it was.
Though it's not a victory for one of the characters in this film.
Yeah. Well, it does show Jackson's plan, but it doesn't show a whole lot else that went on in the Battle of Chancellorsville. But they attack the 11th Corps. They flank it and attack the 11th Corps, one that was heavily German.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Huh. And they just overrun their camp.
Yeah, and then later the Union line stiffened and whatever, but Jackson is scouting the lines and he gets shot by his own troops.
Yeah,
North
it's
Carolina
nighttime.
troops.
Nighttime, he's just walking around, not walking, he's riding with some subordinates and just start getting shot by Confederate soldiers.
Yeah, because it shows the reality of war even to this day, especially back then. Friendly fire, a very real thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then he later gets his arm cut off, and it takes him a while to kick the bucket, and it just takes forever.
Well, I mean, that was in real life.
It did take him a little while. It took him about a week or so.
Died of an infection, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, his arm got cut off, and then...
Well, with his arm off, finally his blood can now be equalized between the two halves of his body. So, I'm sorry, but...
But it just goes on, and then there's some random guy who shows up. There's these two characters who show up kind of at the beginning of the story, and they're in the Stonewall Brigade, and then they show up later, and one of them gets killed, and you're supposed to feel really bad about it, but you're like, I don't know anything about this character.
Yeah, he's like, I got a $15 gold piece in my pocket, and I want you to have it because I know I'm going to die in the next battle. And then he does.
It just is interminable. It just never ends.
Well, I mean, it's a real struggle because how do you make a movie out of the Civil War with the huge scope?
I think you have to narrow. You have to do what Lincoln does, narrow it in. Or what Glory did, which is a good movie, which is focus on a unit and a particular thing. But I think this show is a broad scope movie is just difficult. There's too many things going on.
If this was a movie just about Stonewall Jackson and didn't even try to do any of this John Wilkes Booth garbage or, as much as Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is a beloved person in the Civil War and Jeff Daniels a beloved person to us, maybe just not do it. Maybe just don't feature him in the movie. Just cut. And here's another thing, make Stonewall Jackson more of a complex character because he's really angelic. He really is a killer angel in this movie. He does nothing wrong.
And he doesn't come off as the completely religion-obsessed person that he was. And you noted something interesting about how people complain there's too much religious talk in this. But that's not unusual for the era they were in.
Not at all.
This is the 1860s.
Yeah, religion is an extremely important part of a lot of people's lives. And, wars... The Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, dull that a lot. But at the time, it's an extremely important part of so many people's lives. So, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Consult Corinthians for this next engagement. Stonewall Jackson does that at some point.
Yeah, he does.
And Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain does some stuff, too, in this movie in a similar manner. So, yeah, that's not inaccurate. That's appropriate for the time.
Mm-hmm. And finally it ends, and they're about to go. They're about to go to Gettysburg.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of padding, a lot of fluff.
Yeah. For me, the biggest flaw of the film is definitely just the lack of focus, and these scenes that just go nowhere and have nothing to do with anything. And I do appreciate. I mean, there is no film representation of Fredericksburg. Of Antietam.
Yeah. Actually, Glory briefly has Antietam.
Does it? Okay. Yeah. I have actually...
But none of Shiloh that I can think of. I'm sure there is some, but it probably isn't modern.
Shiloh should have been in this movie. It would have made it more... Well, I don't know. Because I just said you should have a narrower scope, and then I say you should do an entirely different theater with none of the same characters involved. Make it a mini-series. This would be a mini-series.
Mini-series. And focus on one person per episode. Do an episode about Stonewall Jackson.
Exactly.
An episode about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. An episode about Ulysses S. Grant or something.
Imagine if Band of Brothers was one movie. Yeah. That'd be ridiculous.
Yeah. Well,
it'd be terrible.
Yeah.
You'd they're training for 30 minutes, and then suddenly it's D-Day, and then suddenly it's the Battle of the Bulge, and then suddenly it's over, in one movie. And that'd be nuts.
Yeah, and I think the advent of the way TV series have been going lately is, I think honestly, if they were going to do it this time around, they would do it as a 10-part miniseries or something, because then they would have had more time to actually flesh it out than a Bonnet Blue Flag, yeah, Fredericksburg,
Maryland, oh Maryland,
yeah. The interesting things. So two things I want to say. First of all, the end credits song by Bob Dylan.
Yes, bizarrely.
That's strange.
Somebody should ask him if you've ever seen this film, or
But also, I think that the thing about this movie is that it almost felt like it was a movie made for reenactors.
Yes,
I think that's probably part of it too. Is that it probably in some ways is is that if you're a really big Civil War buff, if you like reenactment or you love the Civil War and you read about it all the time, because there was a lot of stuff, because I'm interested in the Civil War, so I've read a decent amount about it, and a lot of this stuff I kind of knew off the top of my head generally what's going on, what Fredericksburg is about or whatever. But if you just come into this like being like, oh, this is about the Civil War, this could be interesting, you're just going to be like, what?
Totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
What is going on? Who is talking?
Yeah.
Who is this guy? We've never seen this guy before. Is this guy going to be important? No, he will not be.
Yeah. So I think that's probably part of what makes it maybe not as popular is that Gettysburg people kind of get, they focused on one or two characters, but it was more about the fighting. And this is just not.
This is like as if Lawrence of Arabia or Lord of the Rings were like not very good movies. They were just poorly paced and nobody cared what was going on. That's what this feels like. You're watching an epic, but it's like not very well done. Yeah,
there's missed opportunities for sure because it is important. I mean, this is an important era, and Stonewall Jackson is an interesting character. Robert E. Lee is interesting. They are important people, but they don't. Yeah, it's just not well done enough.
Yeah,
it also made a terrible video game.
Oh, that's right. I forgot it was. Well, we've talked about it briefly, I think, before, but yeah, it was a terrible video game. One of the worst of all time.
You can't make a first-person shooter when the main weapons are muskets. You just can't. You just can't. You just can't do that. It's either got to be like a melee thing with like swords or something like that, or guns, automatic guns.
Carbines with the lever action.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. But you need something that's a repeater, not...
Yeah.
Rip off the cartridge and then put the powder in and then squeeze the mini ball in and then ram it down and then put the percussion cap on the percussion nipple and all that. Just
reloading it 9 times as espoused by Adelbert Ames in this movie.
Yeah, but there were some missed opportunities though. Other stuff.
Yeah, like what would you want to see in this film?
If they'd focus more on the Battle of Antietam, which is a really important battle, important for people to know about, versus Fredericksburg is just not. And that's, I think, contributed because Antietam while it was a Union victory, it was kind of a draw in a sense. And I think that would have helped people because Fredericksburg is like an out-and-out Confederate victory where they basically don't have to lift a finger. They just slaughter the Union. And I think that probably contributes to some of people thinking this is a pro-Confederate movie is they don't show, like if they showed Bull Run or whatever, and then they showed Antietam and then Chancellorsville, like you could kind of see there's a different flow. But from this, you just think like the Southerners are knights that are just defeating all them nasty Yankees, sort of thing like that. Because Chancellorsville is a huge Confederate victory, but it was a costly one, especially with Jackson's death and all that. But I think if they'd done Antietam rather than Fredericksburg. And the thing is, Stonewall Jackson wasn't really involved in the Battle of Fredericksburg as much. The troops that were at Marye's Heights were from Longstreet's corps, not Jackson's corps. So like there's things that could have been more focused on that. Antietam, there's tons of stuff in Antietam they could have done about, and that could have linked in more with.
I mean, if you're going to make like a Civil War epic, and you are going to do that distributed focus kind of thing, you don't have Grant or Sherman at all in this movie. And they're extremely important later.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, too, by the way, is that this focus is very narrowly on the Eastern Theater.
Yeah.
And, Shiloh and all that. I mean, and the point is, maybe you made the point is in your notes that you wrote up about this, is that like the South actually was taking kind of a beating in the Western Theater. And it kind of conforms to what a lot of people think. There was like the beginning of this, there was Fort Sumter, blah, 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 beginning of the Civil War. There's that Antietam thing. And then there's Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the turning point. And then and then there's nothing else, after that. Even though the war goes on for 2 more years.
Right.
But there's a lot in the West that they could have worked with, and there's just nothing there. And also McClellan should show up at some point in this.
Yeah, I mean, he's there, but it's just like a throwaway thing. In fact, that's a deleted scene, so I don't even know if he's in the real movie or not.
Yeah, he's not, as far as I can remember.
Yeah.
So
we could have Braxton Bragg with his ridiculous eyebrows and giant beard.
Yes.
Such a bad Confederate general that the United States named a military base after him. Thank you, Braxton, for all your good work.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's and I think it was almost too broad. If they'd focused narrowly on Stonewall Jackson or Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, it could have been a better film. Although Jackson would have been better for the earlier part of the war because Chamberlain becomes more famous starting in Gettysburg and later.
Yeah, he doesn't really do anything in this movie, really.
Yeah.
The origin story.
You almost are like, is this like an outtake or something? It's like almost goofy. And the people around him kind of look like they're barely repressing laughter.
It's like a parody of a dramatic scene is what it feels like.
That's what it is. It is like a parody of a dramatic scene.
We could have had some sweet Abner Doubleday scenes, him at the bombardment of Fort Sumter.
They should have had the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Should have been in
That
this.
should have been the opening of this movie. It would have been like an action scene instead of Robert E. Lee just solemnly sitting in a carriage.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, why not? I mean, it's the Civil War. You should show it.
Yeah, that's the beginning of the war.
Or they could have added more about Jackson's craziness. You said Jackson ranting about his organs being out of alignment, like something like that.
Yeah, just showed this guy is a little bit of an oddball.
Or that he also he made mistakes. Like, I mean, he had his huge victories at Second Manassas and Chancellorsville, these huge victories. He did a good job at First Bull Run. But like, the thing is Kernsville or Kernstown, I think it's Kernstown, in March of 1862 was a huge defeat during his Shenandoah campaign. I mean, he also sometimes didn't do a very good job because he looks like this just unstoppable, and kind of it's almost like they're implying that like if Jackson had lived, maybe the South would have won. But like he was hot and cold as a general.
Mm-hmm. And if he was at Gettysburg, who took his command, basically?
AP. Well, so there was only 2 corps in the Army of Northern Virginia while Jackson was alive. There's the 1st Corps under Longstreet and the 2nd Corps under Jackson. Well, they sort of split them up. A good chunk of Jackson's corps plus a division from Longstreet's corps became the 3rd Corps under AP Hill. Okay. So it was 3 corps rather than 2. Okay. And some people said Stonewall Jackson, what if he was at Gettysburg? Would that have changed it? Perhaps, but you never know. I mean, Jackson, again, hot and cold. He could have changed the calculus there, although there's a book called Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg that posits an alternate Gettysburg campaign. And ultimately, the Union still wins. At the end of the day. So, and differently, I mean, Jackson gives them, they still win the war.
Okay.
The Battle of Gettysburg is more of a minor skirmish in that book, but there's actually, I used to play the Sid Meier's Gettysburg game, and there's actually a scenario called Stonewall Jackson alternate Gettysburg, and it's at the first day of Gettysburg. I played that one a lot.
Is it turn-based or is it real-time?
No, it's like real-time, and you have like units and you march them and then go, advance, and George, and all that stuff. And
there's a game called Ultimate General Gettysburg that's interesting. I should show it to you.
I have not played that one.
I think it's kind of a spiritual successor to that Sid Meier's game. But it's got all the divisions, like the Iron Division is there. And
Iron Brigade.
The Iron Brigade is there.
How dare you?
Oh, no. You've exposed me.
No. But no, and honestly, too, is that brings up, we are an alternate history podcast.
That's true.
Is that there is sort of the, some of the Southern, sort of, if only Jackson had lived,
right,
sort of thing like that. And who knows? But that's no guarantee that the war ultimately would have been a Confederate victory.
He's not a superhero.
And that also plays into sort of what some people call like the Eastern bias of like the Eastern theaters, what they think that's what mattered, what happened in the East. It's Gettysburg is a turning point. Gettysburg is a turning point, but a very good argument could be made that Antietam is a turning point, or even closer to that is that some people will tell you that Vicksburg, when it falls July 4th, 1863, so a day after Gettysburg ends, that's the real turning point. Mm-hmm. And that even a Confederate draw at Gettysburg still probably ends up with them losing in the long run because Vicksburg cuts them in half.
Right.
And how well they're doing in the East, in the West, they were getting kind of kicked around.
Yeah. Kicked around the whole war, really.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, you have some victories like Chickamauga.
Yeah, because of rank incompetence.
Yeah.
Literal rank incompetence.
But Ulysses S. Grant really, I mean, some of his campaigns are marvelous. I mean, and the thing is that he was known as like the butcher in the 1864 campaign, these headlong attacks against Lee, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, and all that. But like he was known for being an unbelievably flexible and maneuverable commander in the West, where there was more space to play with.
Yeah.
I mean, the campaign around Vicksburg, his actions at the relief of Chattanooga, I mean, is remarkable in that way. So,
in this movie, we could have had Benjamin Butler. That would have been cool.
Spoon's Butler.
This political appointment, very incompetent when it comes to military matters, but sharp as a tack when it comes to political matters.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that they could have touched on too, is that the Union got better as the war went on, is because there were less political generals as the war went on. You had more political generals at the beginning, but they kind of, wheat from the chaff sort of thing like that.
I mean, McClellan himself ran for president during the Civil War.
1864. Yeah. That's where Lincoln's famous line, "Don't swap horses in the middle of the stream." That was their whole argument. Yeah. And also that McClellan would have done a bad job, which is probably true.
Little Mac, yeah.
Oh, McClellan.
I would like a scene with Benjamin Butler taking spoons away from that woman and like the swelling score. Oh, this beast.
They did call him Beast Butler.
The beast.
There's a funny thing in one of Harry Turtledove's short stories, alternate history stories, where there's a statue of him, and the character comments, "I may be pro-union, but Benjamin Butler's not exactly who you'd pick to be immortalized in bronze." His sagging figure. But
scenes that could have been in this movie. There was a Christmas scene. You could have Judah P. Benjamin celebrating Hanukkah. Singing Hanukkah carols.
No, the thing is that funny enough is he actually was married to a non-Jewish woman, and I don't think he really was that practicing of a Jew.
Interesting. Okay.
But he, that would be funny. They're wearing a little yarmulke, walking around.
There was another one, Yulee or whatever.
David Levy Yulee.
Yeah, and they named a county after him in, I think, Florida, right?
I think it's a city, something like that. I don't know.
Well, there's Levy County, and then there's Yulee as a city in Florida.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. There were other things they could have done with this.
Mm. Many other things.
Yes,
that probably would have been better.
I mean, it's not horrendous.
It's not
great.
I think we maybe overplay how bad the movie is. I mean,
if you're going to watch one of them, watch Gettysburg. Not this.
For real. That's the one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the really good one. Well, that's the much better one.
Yeah.
Similar problems, but they're greatly mitigated.
Yeah. Where's Charlie Sheen in this movie? Keeping the tradition of
as
Sheens.
Robert E. Lee.
They could get Emilio Estevez.
Joe Estevez. I mean, he's the really available one.
Joe, we need you to.
When
are you available? Anytime.
24/7.
What was it we were joking about earlier about like C. Thomas Howell showing up in this movie? You can just send my check to my landlord. No need to.
No.
Just kidding.
C. Thomas Howell.
He was in the movie. He was in Red Dawn.
He was in Red Dawn, really? Mm-hmm. He's one of the teenagers?
Yeah. Wolverines.
In Gods and Generals, we kind of talked about how not everyone in the Union was politically correct. And there's a scene where he says some unkind things about black people. And Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is like, "Hey, I won't have you say that kind of stuff around me." And it'd be so funny if he was like, "And if only there was some kind of drug you could take to make your skin dark so you could learn the travails of living as a black man in these United States. If only there was some film where that could happen."
Soul Man.
Soul Man, yeah. I can't believe that movie's real. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
There's a Pixar movie coming out called Soul. That's about, I think, like the ghost of a jazz musician or something. And I can't help but think that originally they were going to call it Soul Man, but then they found out about that movie.
They're like, we do not want to be associated with this film.
Okay, it's Soul now. Now it's called Soul, yes.
Oh, my God. Yeah, it's just... part of me, the like really history nerd part of me is like, I'm glad that they tried this. I'm glad that they did some stuff. I'm glad that they tried to show some part of the Civil War that doesn't get a lot of attention, because it does feel like sort of how in like World War II, it's like there was Pearl Harbor, and then there was D-Day, and then there was the Battle of the Bulge, and then the atomic bomb. And I think it sometimes feels like in the popular Fort Sumter, then Gettysburg, and then Ford's Theater. I think it's good to show this other stuff. Unfortunately, it comes with the territory. It's just not that interesting.
Yeah.
Or to get into the interesting parts is to so nitpick that the general audience would be like, who's Braxton Bragg?
What is this?
I mean, Don Carlos Buell. Anyone ever heard of that guy? Real Union general.
I have, yes.
Jefferson Davis, a real Union general as well. There was a Jefferson Davis in the Confederacy and then a Jefferson Davis in the Union. Famous for the fact that he murdered his superior and was court-martialed and acquitted.
Was it a duel, or was it just straight up?
An argument. He like walked up to him and like shot him to death in a hotel.
Oh my God.
Supposedly over an insult.
Huh.
Yeah.
Baseball. They could have had baseball in this movie. That would have been not out of place if there was two or
People
three
playing
innings.
Baseball, yeah.
Just
Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball.
No, he did not. Despite what Ken Burns might tell you, he did not invent baseball.
Ken Burns.
That baseball documentary he did, amazing.
I'm sure it is.
You've got to like baseball to enjoy it.
I'm sure it's about 6 hours long, though.
It's longer than 6. Way longer than 6.
How long is it?
I think it's 12 episodes, and I think each episode is like 2 hours long. It's insane. It's absolutely crazy.
Oh, what do they do? Go into how a baseball is stitched?
well, there's so much history to baseball. It starts in the 1800s, and then you've got the dead ball era, and then you got Babe Ruth, and then you got like Ted Williams, and
wow,
you go literally to like the early 2000s. I think is when they stop.
I've actually seen him speak in person. I went to an event where he was speaking at. It was about his documentary, The War, which is about World War II.
And this was in high school. I think I remember you saying on the weekend, I'm going to go see Ken Burns.
Yes, I did. It's actually during, I think it was a weekday, because I remember going from school, and again, my poor father agreed to take me. But he was actually quite interesting. He was a good speaker. And again, I was also the youngest person there by several decades.
That's great. When I went to see Master and Commander, it was a similar thing.
Yeah, I saw that movie in theaters too. That actually is a pretty good movie.
Yeah, I really like that movie.
This movie, it is what it is. And frankly, since then, other than Lincoln, I can't really think of any Civil War era movies. Oh, The Free State of Jones, of course.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen that.
I have not seen it. It looks.
That seems like there's a movie that came out. It's called T-34. Good movie. I enjoyed it, but like it's a fantasy. It's not a realistic movie. Like in the trailer, it says based on a true legend, which
a true legend. What the hell does that mean?
A true underdog story. T-34.
T-34.
And that's kind of what I feel like the Free State of Jones must be. Like it's not.
Yeah,
realistic.
I don't know. I never saw it.
Yeah, me neither.
Other than that, what other movies involve the Civil War? Cold Mountain.
Cold Mountain. Yeah, they have a Battle of the Crater thing.
That's not about the Civil War, really.
Not really. There's one of the Sergio Leone movies. I think.
Yeah, those are.
Oh, I think it's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I think that it's that one.
Is it?
Yeah.
The Outlaw Josie Wales.
Oh yeah, that's actually a pretty cool movie. It's actually pretty good. The author though, unfortunately, is this guy who did segregationist speeches, and he wrote this book under a Native American pen name, and then he like won an award, and it was like, actually, I'm a white guy. I'm not. I think it's called The Education of Little Tree is one of the books he wrote, and it was on the Oprah Winfrey reading list, and they were like, Oprah, I have bad news for you, but
this guy
is like not actually a Native American. But it's a good movie though. Clint Eastwood, and he's hanging out with these Indian guys. And
yeah, he has a Gatling gun in that movie.
He does, yeah. And that's what, Kansas. He's from Kansas, right? It's bleeding Kansas at the beginning.
I think so. Or Kansas was a theater in the war. There was some fighting there.
I think he's one of Quantrell's raiders.
Yes, he was. That's not too PC.
Not a nice guy.
Yeah.
But there's also like Jayhawkers or whatever.
There are Jayhawkers, yeah.
Not nice guys either.
Yeah.
You know?
We're the Kansas Jayhawks. That's what the Jayhawks. That's the mascot for the University of Kansas. KU.
Interesting.
They're the Jayhawkers. That's where it comes from. Huh. They certainly weren't going to be the Kansas Quantrill Raiders. Well, I think that's probably about it.
Yeah.
Well, this is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.